I'm Miles Thatcher, 33 years old, and as I stepped into the front hallway of our apartment with my duffel bag slung over one shoulder and the sting of dry desert wind still clinging to my skin, I knew I should have said no to dinner that evening. But when Clara walked toward me barefoot and smiling, her arms wide, her voice soft and certain with a hint of pleading when she said, "It's just a couple hours, and it's Mom's birthday," I nodded before I could think, even though my body was aching and my eyes burned from days without enough sleep. The job I had just finished wasn't glamorous, not the kind that wins awards or gets a glossy spread in magazines, but it paid what we needed, and I was good at it. On-location product shoots in punishing climates for a campaign no one would remember 6 months from now, climbing into cargo vans at 5 in the morning, stringing lights from rusted scaffolds, wiping dust off lenses with the edge of my shirt while a client paced behind me, asking for changes they couldn't describe. Clara offered to reschedule the dinner when she saw how exhausted I looked, but I could see how much it meant to her. The way she mentioned her mom had already set the table with the heirloom china, that her father was actually in a decent mood, and that her brother and his wife would be there too. So I dragged myself into the shower, shaved the desert off my face, put on a clean button-down, and we drove in silence through streets that glowed orange with early evening sun. Her parents' house sat at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac, tall and symmetrical, with hedges trimmed like topiary soldiers and a brass door knocker shaped like a lion's head that I'd always thought was a bit much, though I never said it aloud, just like I never said anything about how her mother always called me Miles the camera guy, even after 3 years of marriage. Inside, the scent of pot roast and citrus cleaner mixed thick in the air, and her mother, Evelyn, met us at the door wearing a pastel sweater set in pearls, her lipstick applied with surgical precision, smiling just a second too long before leaning in to kiss Clara and offer me a tepid, "Welcome back from," where was it again? I told her again that it was the Mojave region, not that she was listening, already calling for Clara to help her check on the rolls, leaving me alone in the entryway with Alan, my father-in-law, who gave me the same once-over he always did, his eyes scanning my shoes, then my shirt, then the camera bag over my shoulder, before offering a handshake like a formality he resented. Dinner started like most of them did, with Alan launching into a story about closing a deal faster than the other guy knew what hit him, Evelyn adjusting napkins no one had touched, and Clara's brother James telling a mild joke while his wife Emily smiled too quickly, her eyes always darting toward Evelyn the way a kid glances at a strict teacher. I tried to eat and listen and pretend I wasn't counting down the minutes in my head, sipping the same beer Alan always mocked, imported hipster stuff, he'd say, until Evelyn stood up halfway through dessert and clapped her hands like she was announcing a game show segment, saying she'd made a special sangria, and that Miles is going to love it. I just know it. She disappeared into the kitchen before anyone could respond. And something about the way she moved, too fast, like she was ahead of time or no one else could see, caught my attention, so I stood up under the pretense of offering to help, walking slowly into the hallway that led to the kitchen, my footsteps quiet on the polished wood floors. From the edge of the doorway, I saw her standing at the counter, back turned, 2 wine glasses set apart from the others on a smaller tray beside the main one, her left hand holding a tiny vial between 2 fingers, her right tipping it quickly into one of the glasses before she wiped the rim with a napkin and adjusted her expression like she'd just practiced it. I stepped in fully, forcing a casual tone, telling her I'd carry the tray for her, and for the briefest second her body went rigid before she smiled too wide, handed me the smaller tray, and said, "That one's for you, Miles, my loveliest son-in-law," using the exact same phrase she'd used at our wedding toast, except back then it sounded sincere, and now it clanged like a coin dropped in a charity box for show. The glass she meant for me had a faint shimmer on top, a barely there film that caught the overhead light differently than the others, so I made sure not to hesitate as I took the tray and turned toward the dining room, balancing it just enough to cause a distraction when I pretended to adjust one glass and instead swapped the one she'd given me with the one at the head of the table. Alan was flipping through something on his phone when I reached him, barely glancing up as I placed the drink in front of him, nodding toward it and saying, "Sangria, sir," like I was a waiter dropping off a tab. I sat down beside Clara, who was too busy smiling at something James had said to notice I'd picked up a glass of water instead, and when Evelyn returned with the rest of the drinks, she didn't seem to notice the switch, her attention fixed on whether the spoons had been placed at the correct angle beside the dessert plates. 45 minutes later, Alan's face was slick with sweat and his collar tugged open, his voice thick and slurred as he stood too fast and stumbled toward the hallway, knocking into a sideboard with enough force to rattle the silverware. Evelyn calling after him with a high-pitched voice that cracked halfway through his name. Clara stood immediately, concern in her voice, and James followed her down the hallway, but I stayed seated, watching Evelyn as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the glass in front of Alan's now empty chair. That's when she looked at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I didn't flinch or say a word. She knew, and now she knew that I knew. Evelyn moved quickly through the dining room after Alan, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that betrayed her tension, even though her voice called out in smooth, practiced concern, repeating his name with the same syrupy cadence she used whenever guests were present, and I waited until everyone else had followed before rising slowly from my chair, steadying the tray in my hands, and walking calmly into the kitchen where the untouched glass sat waiting near the edge of the sink. I wrapped it in one of the linen napkins Evelyn was so particular about, folding it carefully to keep the rim protected, and slipped it into my camera bag before returning to the dining room, where Clara and Emily were now gathering plates with nervous small talk that didn't cover the thud of something heavy against the bathroom wall down the hall, followed by a low, muffled groan that made Emily stop mid-sentence and exchange a wide-eyed glance with her husband. "Must have been the shrimp," James said to no one in particular, his voice uncertain, eyes searching the table for clues, while I sat back down and calmly spooned the rest of the chocolate mousse onto my plate, nodding when Clara asked if I was feeling okay and replying that I preferred water with dessert, my appetite unaffected even as Alan's retching echoed faintly down the hallway like a warning shot. Evelyn returned a few minutes later with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her smile brittle and her voice trembling just enough to sound human when she said that Alan was resting, probably just something he ate earlier that didn't sit right, and she was so sorry the evening had taken a turn, but insisted we should enjoy the rest of dessert while it was still fresh. No one ate much after that. Clara offered to help clean up, and while Evelyn nodded with the right expressions, her eyes kept darting to the empty chair at the head of the table, her mouth twitching slightly whenever I looked at her directly, and though nothing was said aloud, the air in the room had shifted into something heavy and volatile, like a gas leak no one wanted to acknowledge. James and Emily left first, making vague promises to check in on Alan tomorrow, and Clara and I followed soon after, with Evelyn lingering at the front door, her hand resting on the edge of the frame like she needed the support, thanking us again for coming, her words so polite and hollow I could hear the lie trembling beneath every syllable. In the car, Clara turned to me and said she hoped her dad would be okay, that he'd been off all week anyway, probably stressed from the market or his new diet, and when I nodded and said I was sure he'd bounce back, she smiled a little and rested her head against the window, watching the streetlights stutter across the glass as we drove in silence. At home, I took the napkin-wrapped glass from my camera bag and placed it in a small padded case I usually reserve for lenses, locked it inside the studio cabinet where I kept old hard drives and backup batteries, and sat for a long time in the dark, listening to the hum of the fridge and the quiet shifting sounds of Clara getting ready for bed, my fingers still tingling from the weight of what I'd seen. The next morning, after Clara left for work, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year, Dominic, an old client who'd once paid me in cash and favors to shoot a discreet set of photos for a lawsuit involving his father's company, a man whose gratitude had extended to introductions I never used, until now. When he answered, his voice was alert and clipped, and after a brief exchange of small talk that felt too casual for what I was about to ask, I told him I needed something tested quietly, something chemical, probably medical, and he didn't ask what it was, just gave me an address and told me to bring it tonight. No questions, no names, just results. That night, after Clara fell asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to her chin and the TV humming low in the background, I took the case and drove across town to a nondescript building marked only by a buzzer and a single light over the door, where Dominic met me in a hoodie and sweatpants and led me inside without speaking. In the back room, a woman named Elle, whose real name I never learned, took the glass from me with gloved hands, and said it would take 2 or 3 days to isolate anything useful, but that if something was in there, they'd find it. And when I asked if it could be discreet, she gave me a look that said I shouldn't have needed to ask. I thanked them both, left a plain envelope with a cash donation on the counter, and drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold, the sharp air slicing through the car like a blade, helping me stay awake as the weight of the situation sank further into my chest. For the next 3 days, I said nothing. I made breakfast for Clara, edited photos in the studio, answered client emails, and tried not to think about the moment Evelyn had turned around in the kitchen with that too bright smile and the trembling fingers wrapped around the stem of that glass. Try not to imagine the countless dinners before that one, the small slights, the offhand comments, the invitations phrased like obligations. I wonder how long she'd hated me. Not in the loud way that Alan had, with his jokes about real jobs and men who provide, but in the quiet, eroding way Evelyn practiced. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, framed in hospitality and passive praise, her voice always soft enough to sound like kindness. When Dominic finally called, I was standing in the backyard staring at the neighbor's broken fence and wondering whether I should fix it just to have something to do. There were benzodiazepines in the glass, he said without preamble, and I could hear paper rustling in the background as he read from the report, listing the dosage, the likely effect, sedation, memory issues, hours of unconsciousness. And when I asked if it could have been accidental, he laughed once, short and humorless, and said, "Not unless someone accidentally stirred 2 milligrams into sangria." I asked for a written report, and he emailed it before we hung up. The file name simple and untraceable, the summary clear and damning. I didn't tell Clara that night. I sat on the porch with a blanket and watched the street go quiet, the sound of tires on wet pavement fading into the distance, and thought about the way Evelyn's hand had trembled just before she handed me that glass, how her voice had faltered only once before snapping back into her performance. She had made a choice, and now I had to decide what to do with it. 3 days after the call from Dominic confirmed what I already suspected but hadn't let myself believe out loud. I stood in our kitchen rinsing out the French press while Clara flipped through her planner at the table, her pen tapping absently against the ceramic edge of her coffee mug. And when she mentioned that her mother wanted updated headshots for some new project, something about joining the board of the community organization that needed refined, trustworthy-looking imagery, I felt my chest tighten slightly, not with fear, but with the cold click of timing falling into place like a well-oiled lock. Clara said Evelyn had asked for me specifically, said she'd insisted it would mean a lot if I could bring my camera by sometime this week. And while I pretended to weigh my schedule and muttered something about deadlines, I could see that Clara was already touched by her mother's gesture, hopeful in the way people are when they're desperate to believe a change has occurred. I told her I'd think about it, and later that day, I stared at my calendar long enough to forget what day it was, the silence of the studio only broken by the faint hum of my computer and the occasional stretch and creak of the old hardwood beneath my desk chair, the email from Dominic with the lab report open on one screen, while I pulled out a small envelope and began printing out copies, not just the toxicology summary, but the prescriptions I had tracked down through public records and a few favors, 3 different doctors, overlapping dates, dosages that escalated over time, like someone testing the limits of what they could get away with. That night, while Clara slept, I sorted everything into a folder. I labeled Set A and another copy into Set B, slipping the originals into a fireproof lockbox beneath the floorboards of the studio, because I had no idea yet where this was going, only that I needed to hold on to every scrap of proof before someone tried to twist the truth again. When I texted Evelyn the next morning and said I could come by on Saturday afternoon for the shoot, she replied almost immediately, overly cheerful, telling me to bring whatever you need. I'll be ready. And I read her words over and over again, wondering whether she believed I had forgotten everything or whether she knew I hadn't and simply didn't care. I arrived at the house alone that Saturday, camera bag over my shoulder, folder in hand, dressed in a way I knew she'd approve of, button-down shirt, clean shave, polished shoes, because I wanted her disarmed, wanted her to believe I was still playing the role she'd assigned me, right up until the moment I didn't. Evelyn greeted me at the door wearing a pale blue blouse and pearl earrings that matched the one she wore at our wedding, her hair styled into the kind of gentle wave that took 40 minutes and a can of hairspray to maintain, and she smiled with a tightness I recognized now not as politeness, but calculation. She offered coffee, which I declined, and led me into the sitting room where the light was good and the decor hadn't changed in decades. Dustless wood furniture, cream-colored drapes, and a fireplace filled with decorative logs that had never once been lit in the years I'd known this family. And I waited until she sat down on the tufted bench near the window before speaking. "Before we start," I said, opening the folder slowly, deliberately, and handing it to her without ceremony, "I thought you might want to see this." She took it with both hands, and for a moment I saw a flicker of confusion cross her face, her mouth tightening as she opened the first page and read the lab header, then the report summary, her eyes scanning the medical terms before landing on the word benzodiazepines. And I saw it land. The recognition, the weight of exposure, followed by the sharp inhale of someone realizing they were not alone in a game they thought they were winning. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected, a rasp covered in disbelief as she whispered, "This is ridiculous. I would never. We both know what happened," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost bored as I stepped back and lifted the camera, not to shoot, but to cradle it like a silent witness. "What I don't know," I continued, "is why." Her fingers clenched around the folder, knuckles paling, and, after a long pause that stretched too far to be casual, she finally set the papers beside her and looked up at me with a face that had cracked somewhere behind the mask, her expression less angry than resigned. "You're not good enough for her," she said simply, without venom, as though stating a fact too obvious to deserve emotion. "You never have been." I didn't respond, just waited. "She deserves stability," she added, her tone flat now, "not whatever this is, your studio, your travel, your whims. She needs someone who can give her something solid." And drugging me was supposed to prove what? I asked, still calm, still standing, my camera slung low at my side. "It wasn't going to hurt you," she snapped, and the mask slipped again, frustration bleeding in her voice. "Just make you sick, miss your little gallery show, show her you're unreliable, that she can't count on you when it matters." I let the words hang there for a beat too long. "You were willing to sabotage your daughter's husband, just to win a point," I said, not as a question, not anymore. She didn't answer. I stepped toward her, slowly, and set another envelope beside the first, this one thicker, with copies of her overlapping prescriptions, dated and sourced, and at the top a letter I had drafted and signed, ready to be delivered to the medical board if I chose. "Here's what happens next," I said, and she looked up again, this time with something like fear in her eyes. "You tell Alan exactly what you did, and then you start treating me with the respect I've earned. Not because you like me, not because you believe I'm good enough, but because the alternative is that Clara finds out every last detail of what you've done and what you've been hiding." She scoffed, a sound meant to wound, but it rang hollow in the quiet room. "She'd never believe you over me," Evelyn said, voice rising just enough to sound like a warning rather than a threat. I picked up my camera bag. "Maybe not," I said, "but she'll believe a certified report, 3 overlapping prescriptions, and her own mother caught on a neighbor's security footage in the kitchen that night." Her mouth opened, then closed. "You're bluffing. Do you want to bet your daughter on that?" I walked out without taking a single photo. The message came that night, not even 6 hours after I left their house, without firing a single shutter. And the way Evelyn spun her version so quickly, so fluently, almost impressed me in a way that made my stomach churn, because the lie was rehearsed and delivered with the same practice cadence she used for every family toast and Sunday benediction. Only now it was wrapped in trembling pauses and words that didn't quite fit her usual narrative, hostile, threatening, unprovoked. Clara sat on the edge of the bed with her phone pressed tightly to her ear, her face pale and expressionless as her mother's voice poured through the speaker. And I stayed across the room, leaning against the doorframe with my arms crossed and my pulse hammering beneath the surface, not out of fear, but from the quiet fury of watching the trap begin to spring exactly as expected. "She said you came in angry," Clara said after she hung up, not looking at me yet, not meeting my eyes, her voice distant, as if she were reading lines she didn't understand. "Said you threatened to expose private medical details and left without taking a single picture, that you scared her, Miles." I didn't move right away. Instead, I stepped forward slowly, reached into the drawer of my desk, and pulled out the same folder Evelyn had pretended not to understand. Lab results, prescription copies, overlapping refills, every documented decision she tried to bury beneath that fragile smile persona of hers, and I laid them gently on the bed beside Clara, careful not to say anything until she picked them up. At first, she scanned them like they were part of someone else's story, her brow furrowing as the dates began to overlap and the dosage instructions grew inconsistent. And I could tell the moment it hit her that the report wasn't fake, that the test was real, that something had indeed been slipped into a glass at her mother's birthday dinner, and that it had never been intended for Alan at all. "Why didn't you show me this earlier?" she whispered, but her voice lacked accusation, and I understood she was asking from a place of shock, not betrayal. "I needed to be sure," I said, sitting down beside her, keeping my hands folded tightly between my knees so I wouldn't reach for her too soon, not just about what she did, but how she'd react when she thought she'd gotten away with it. She turned a page, stopped, and stared at the name of one of the doctors, someone she recognized clearly from childhood appointments or school recommendations, and then she closed the folder and rested it on her lap, staring ahead without seeing anything. "I still can't believe it," she said finally, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and that crack held the truth more than any word could. "I didn't want to make you choose," I said, and this time I did reach for her hand, just lightly, but I'm not going to let her turn this around on me. Not again. Later that night, while she sat silently with a blanket draped over her shoulders and the TV muttering soft nonsense in the background, I pulled up the footage Vanessa had given me weeks before. The drive I hadn't told Clara about yet, because I wanted her to see the documents first, to process the hard evidence before hearing the undeniable sound of Evelyn's voice, furious and unguarded. I queued up the video to the moment Evelyn, believing the house was empty, screamed at Alan with a venom I hadn't even known she possessed, blaming him for drinking the wrong glass, her voice sharp and shaking as she said, "You idiot! Do you even think before you touch things?" That was for him. And then Alan's voice, hoarse and panicked, not because of the drink, but because of the implications. "This isn't the first time, Evelyn. You've done this before." The next clip rolled automatically. 2 days later, Evelyn pacing the living room while Alan stood by the window, arms folded, his expression grim as he said, "He knows, Evelyn. He knows everything." "So what?" she snapped, turning on him like a switch had flipped. "It's his word against mine. Clara will never believe him over us." "If she does," Alan muttered, "then maybe she isn't the daughter you think she is." "Don't worry," Evelyn said, calmer now, her tone gliding into something syrupy and cruel. "I've already started planting seeds. By the time I'm done, she'll be filing for divorce and thinking it was her own decision." I paused the video and turned to Clara, who had stopped breathing somewhere around Evelyn's last sentence, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide and glassy as she stared at the frozen image of her parents in the corner of the frame. "I got this 3 weeks ago," I said gently, not apologetically, "for Vanessa." Clara didn't speak for a long time. Then, without a word, she stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a glass of water that she held without drinking, her fingers wrapped tightly around the rim as she sat beside me again. "I need to talk to them," she said finally, her voice low and steady, the kind of voice people use when they're trying to push through heartbreak with logic. "Not tomorrow. Now." I nodded and handed her the flash drive. "You'll want this," I said. She left the house just before midnight, and I didn't follow, didn't ask to come, didn't offer advice. I just stood at the window and watched the taillights of her car disappear down the street, praying she wouldn't return looking smaller than when she left. When she did come home, hours later, her face was pale and her eyes red, but there was something in the way she moved, slower, heavier, that told me she had carried the weight all the way to their doorstep and dropped it there without asking for permission. She closed the door behind her quietly, walked into the living room, and sat down on the edge of the couch like someone bracing for bad news. "They said it was a misunderstanding," she said softly, her voice brittle, "that you're unstable, paranoid, that you've always been jealous of how close I am with them." I didn't answer. She turned toward me, met my eyes, and added, "But they didn't deny it. Not really. They just twisted it." What do you think? I asked more gently than I expected. She looked away, then back again, and when she spoke, the words were slow and raw. I think I don't know who my parents are anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara drifted in and out of silence like a tide I could no longer predict, speaking only when necessary, keeping her responses short but not cold. And though she never pulled away physically, never moved to the guest room or avoided my touch, there was a noticeable weight in her presence, the kind that makes a room feel smaller without anyone needing to speak. And I found myself staying in the studio longer each day, not out of avoidance, but because the quiet between us had started to hum with the kind of tension that could snap if pressed too hard. She went to see her parents twice during that time, each visit followed by late-night returns and long showers that steamed up the bathroom mirror but never seemed to wash the heaviness from her shoulders. And when I asked if she wanted to talk, she would shake her head almost imperceptibly, as though the act of forming words around what she was feeling would require more energy than she could spare. I didn't push, didn't ask for explanations, because I already knew how deep the roots of her family's control ran, how carefully they had trained her to doubt herself whenever their version of reality clashed with what she sensed in her gut. And the last thing I wanted was to make her feel like I was trying to win her over when this wasn't a game I ever wanted to play. So I worked. I edited images for clients I no longer cared about, drafted marketing emails I would never send, and spent hours staring at proofs of landscapes I'd shot years ago, before I met Clara, when everything in my life was uncertain, but at least it had been mine, untouched by the invisible weight of another family's expectations. Then one afternoon, a small padded envelope arrived with no return address, just my name written in unfamiliar handwriting across the front, and the moment I held it, I felt that strange pressure again, the sensation of something about to break, not violently, but like ice cracking beneath your feet in the middle of a thaw. Inside was a USB drive wrapped in tissue paper and a folded note on plain stationery that read, "You should see this. Vanessa." I sat down at the studio desk, plugged in the drive, and opened the only folder it contained. For video files, each marked with a date and timestamp, beginning with the night of the birthday dinner, the same night Evelyn had smiled too brightly and handed me a drink that shimmered just slightly in the light. The first video showed the kitchen from an overhead corner angle, clearly part of a home security system. Evelyn entering the frame, standing at the counter with 2 wine glasses and retrieving something small from her pocket before uncapping it and emptying the contents into only one of the glasses, stirring it briefly with a cocktail stick, and wiping the rim with a paper towel before aligning both glasses as if nothing had happened. Then I entered the frame, stepped up beside her, and took the glasses, pausing for just a beat before turning and walking out again. And though no sound accompanied the footage, I remembered the moment vividly. Her too sweet voice saying, "Special drink for my loveliest son-in-law," and the way her hand trembled slightly when she thought I hadn't noticed. The second video came from a different angle, lower, near the hallway, showing Alan in the dining room later that night, taking the glass I placed in front of him, raising it absently as he scrolled on his phone, sipping once then twice before setting it down with a grimace and wiping his forehead as though the heat in the room had suddenly spiked. The third video was the one that changed everything. Dated the night after the dinner, it showed Evelyn and Alan standing in the kitchen again, this time under harsh overhead light, their postures rigid, their voices raised just loud enough for the camera's microphone to pick up. "You're blaming me for your screw-up?" Alan shouted, slamming a cabinet door closed, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You poured it into the wrong glass." "No," Evelyn snapped, her voice cold and fast. "You picked up the wrong one. I had it separated. I had it marked." "And what exactly were you hoping would happen to him, Evelyn?" Alan asked, stepping toward her with a kind of controlled rage that made him look less like the man who mocked my profession over dinner and more like someone realizing the person beside him was a stranger. "Nothing serious," she hissed. "Just enough to make him miss the gallery show, make him look irresponsible, like a flake." Clara would have started questioning him, and once that started, the rest would have followed. Alan stepped back, disgusted, and said, "This isn't the first time you've done something like this, is it?" She didn't answer. The fourth and final clip had no date, just a timestamp. but it was clearly recorded sometime after I'd started pulling away from the family dinners, showing Evelyn and Alan in their living room again, the fireplace behind them cold and dark, her voice low but unmistakably bitter as she said, "He knows what I did. He's going to try to ruin us." Then start planting doubt. Alan replied with frightening ease, as though this was not new to him. "Clara listens to you. Tell her he's unstable, obsessive. Make it about his pride." "I've already started," Evelyn said with a small, satisfied nod. "By the time I'm done, she'll think the idea of divorce was hers." I watched the footage 3 times in silence, each time feeling my pulse slow and my focus sharpen, not because the shock wore off, but because the clarity settled deeper. Their strategy wasn't random, wasn't an act of sudden resentment, but a pattern, a system, one they'd used before and would use again unless stopped. I called Vanessa the moment the 3rd viewing ended, and when she answered, I could hear the tightness in her voice, the sound of someone holding something in for far too long. "I had to send it," she said before I could speak. "They did the same thing to me when I married James. Told him I was manipulative, selfish, unfit to be a mother. It almost worked, Miles. Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, not accusingly, but with the aching need to understand how deep the damage had gone. "Because James worships Alan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And every time I tried to show him the truth, he made excuses, said I was imagining things. I couldn't take being called paranoid by the person I loved." There was a long pause between us, filled with the static hum of 2 people realizing how similar their stories had become. "But I couldn't watch them do it to you too," she added, and then her voice lowered even further. "And Miles, there's more. You need to ask Clara about someone named Mason." Vanessa's voice lingered in my ear long after the call ended, her final words spiraling quietly in my thoughts as I sat alone in the studio with the lights off and the faint glow of the monitor flickering across my hands, the name Mason echoing louder than it should have, not because it meant something to me, at least not yet, but because of the way she had said it, like someone opening a door that had been nailed shut for years. I didn't ask Clara that night. She was already asleep when I came back into the house, curled on her side with the blanket pulled up to her chin and one hand resting lightly on the pillow beside her, her face soft with exhaustion but still shadowed by the weight of everything she had begun to unearth, and I didn't want to add another brick to the pile pressing against her chest until I knew what, exactly, I was placing there. Instead, I started digging. The next morning, while Clara ran errands and the house fell into its usual weekend hush, I opened my laptop and began tracing names through alumni pages, public records, half-buried social profiles, anything that might link a Mason to Clara's past. And after an hour of weaving through vague connections and deactivated accounts, I found him. Mason Kerr, graduate student in anthropology at the same university where Clara had completed her environmental sciences degree, photographed once an A. Group field research trip, standing beside Clara with his hand on her shoulder and an expression that wasn't quite possessive, but too intimate to be accidental. I kept going, sifting through article archives, student group mentions, faculty newsletters, and eventually landed on a grainy image from the university's online newspaper showing Mason giving a campus presentation. Clara seated in the front row, her expression open and focused in a way I hadn't seen since our earliest dates, before the weight of family politics and career condescension had crept into our lives like mold through drywall. Then I found something else, a blog post, archived and mostly deleted, but partially cached on a link aggregation site, written by someone anonymous but clearly close to the situation, describing a sudden, messy breakup between the grad school golden couple, with hints of infidelity, parental interference, and a suspiciously timed scholarship withdrawal that led to Mason's early departure from the program. There was no proof Evelyn or Alan were involved. But I didn't need proof yet. I needed the truth. That night, while Clara washed dishes and the sound of running water covered the quiet tension between us, I stepped into the kitchen and asked, as gently as I could, "Clara, who's Mason?" She turned slowly, the dish towel in her hand falling still, and for a long moment she didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the tiled floor, as though searching for a way to step around the question instead of through it. And when she finally looked up, I saw something break open behind her eyes, Not guilt, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes the past they buried has begun to claw its way back through the surface. "We were engaged," she said softly, not looking away, not trying to soften the word, "for almost a year." I nodded, letting the silence stretch, just enough to let her know I was listening, not judging, and she leaned back against the counter, arms folded across her chest like she needed the pressure to stay upright. "It started fast," she continued, her voice low and steady. "We met in a class, started working on a research project together. It was easy, natural, and I thought we had the same future in mind." "What happened?" I asked, though I already knew part of the answer. "My parents didn't like him," she said with a faint, bitter laugh. "They thought he was unfocused, not polished enough. He didn't come from money, didn't have connections, and my dad said he was using me for upward mobility, whatever the hell that meant." I stayed quiet. "They started small," Clara continued, her voice thickening. "My mom would say he was too intense, that he didn't smile enough, that he was isolating me from the family. And then things escalated. Anonymous emails to the department, rumors about plagiarism, and then the scholarship committee pulled his funding." I watched her expression shift as the memories returned, her face clouding with confusion and pain that clearly still hadn't been given a place to settle. "He tried to fight it," she said, "but when he asked me to help, to confront my parents, I was scared, and I didn't know who to believe anymore, and by the time I tried to fix it, he was gone." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with understanding, the kind that grows in the soil of shared wounds. And when I stepped forward and took her hand, she didn't pull away. "I think they did the same thing to you," she said finally, "only worse." "They've done it to more than just us," I said, and she looked at me sharply. "Vanessa?" she asked. I nodded. She stepped back, bracing herself against the counter, and whispered, "How far does this go?" I didn't have an answer, not yet, but I knew what I needed to do next. The following morning, I reached out to Mason. His number wasn't listed, and his social media presence had evaporated entirely, but I found an old faculty contact at a community college in a nearby city where his name appeared once on a guest lecture flyer. And after 3 phone calls and 1 carefully worded voicemail, he called me back. He was cautious at first, his voice clipped and hesitant, but when I said Clara's name, followed by my own, and added, "I believe your story," something changed in his tone, and he agreed to meet. We chose a quiet cafe in a strip mall off a frontage road, neutral and forgettable, the kind of place no one visits without purpose. And when he walked in wearing a denim jacket and thick-rimmed glasses, I saw in his posture a familiar weariness. The look of someone who'd been carrying disbelief for years without anyone willing to help him set it down. We sat across from each other, neither of us touching the coffee we ordered, and I laid out what I had. The lab report, the video footage, the manipulated breakup, the pattern repeating across lives like a blueprint drawn in pencil and sharpened over time. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder that mirrored mine in eerie symmetry. Printouts of emails, disciplinary letters, scholarship notices, and a long, personal letter he had once written to Clara, but never sent. "They got to her before I could," he said, sliding it across the table. "And when I tried to confront them, they made sure no one believed me." I took the letter without opening it, nodded once, and said, "They're not going to do it again." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "Make sure she knows the truth." By the time I arrived home from the cafe, the late afternoon sky had deepened into that strange, golden haze that always preceded stormy evenings in our part of the state, where the light made everything look washed out and cinematic at the same time. And as I pulled into the driveway and saw Clara through the window, folding laundry with slow, deliberate movements, I knew I couldn't wait any longer to show her what Mason had given me. Not because I wanted to rush her healing or vindicate myself, but because keeping the truth from her now felt like participating in the same quiet manipulations her parents had relied on for years. Inside, I set the folder gently on the table between us and waited until she looked up, her fingers still wrapped around a towel she hadn't realized she was holding for too long. And when I told her that I'd met with Mason and that he'd shared his side of everything, she didn't speak right away, just placed the towel beside her, sat down across from me, and opened the folder like someone unsealing a letter they never expected to read. There were photocopies of university correspondence with clipped, impersonal language announcing disciplinary action for vague violations, a digital copy of the scholarship revocation notice with funding reassessment circled in red ink, and finally, the letter, the one he'd written but never sent, printed on plain paper with the date still at the top. Folded just once like he had never stopped hoping she might someday, read it without judgment. Clara read the first few lines silently, her eyes scanning the page with growing tension in her shoulders. And when she reached the part where Mason detailed the night he found out about the scholarship being pulled, after her parents had hosted him for dinner and asked strangely specific questions about his future plans, her breath caught, and I watched her blink rapidly, trying to stay composed. She didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she folded the letter neatly, returned it to the folder, and asked me one question, her voice low and shaking. How many other people have they done this to? I didn't have an exact number, but I told her what Vanessa had shared, how Evelyn and Alan had nearly driven her out of the family with whispers and cold smiles, how they had tried to poison her credibility behind James's back until her pregnancy gave them a new kind of leverage, one they could wrap in baby blankets and use to disguise their control as concern. Clara sat back in the chair, her hand pressed against her forehead, the folder still resting in front of her like it radiated heat, and when she finally looked at me again, there was something in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not grief, but a quiet, gathering resolve that made me feel both protective and proud at the same time. We need to do something, she said, and this time it wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision. I told her what I had already begun compiling: testimonies, printouts, audio files, the lab report, the video footage, Mason's letter, and how I'd been saving it to build something unshakable, not to ruin her parents publicly, but to make sure that if they ever tried to do this to anyone else, we could stop them without warning. But Clara had another idea. We show Owen and Vanessa, she said, everything. And then, if they're ready, we show my parents together. It was a bold move, one I hadn't anticipated, because Owen had always played the loyal son, the agreeable mediator who found comfort in his role as the family's peacekeeper. And despite everything, I knew that his image of their parents was still intact in a way Clara's had already begun to corrode. Are you sure? I asked, not to challenge her, but to give her room to step back if she needed to. No more secrets, she replied, and I believed her. The following Thursday, we invited Owen and Vanessa over under the pretense of catching up, and while Vanessa's smile was tight with understanding the moment, she stepped into the living room and saw the flash drive beside the laptop on the coffee table. Owen's expression stayed open, warm, oblivious to what was coming, and I felt a deep ache in my chest for how far he would have to fall in the next hour. Clara did most of the talking. She started with the dinner, the drink, the test results, and then the footage, pausing between clips to let Owen catch up, to watch his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of brittle denial that cracked each time another clip played, each time Evelyn's voice was heard, unfiltered and unmistakable, planning and planting and plotting the slow erosion of her daughter's marriage. Vanessa sat quietly, her hand resting gently on Owen's knee, but when we reached the fourth video, the one where Evelyn said, "By the time I'm done, she'll think the divorce was her idea," Vanessa turned to her husband and whispered, "They said the same thing about me." Owen looked at her sharply, a flush rising to his cheeks. But before he could speak, she continued, her voice trembling but steady enough to land each word with painful precision. "They called me manipulative," she said, "told you I was trying to isolate you, said I didn't respect the family, and you believed them, even when I begged you to see what they were doing." Owen's hands dropped to his lap, palms up, helpless. "I didn't know," he muttered, but the words rang hollow. Too late, too soft. "You didn't want to know," Vanessa replied, and the silence that followed was the kind that wrapped around everyone in the room and tightened. Eventually, Owen turned to Clara, his face pale, eyes searching. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not just walk away?" "Because walking away means they win," Clara said, not angrily, but with the weight of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for asking the questions no one wanted answered. "Because we have a daughter one day, or a son, and they'll try to get their hand around them too. Owen didn't speak again. Instead, he nodded slowly and reached across the table to pick up the flash drive, turning it over in his hand like it might sting him. And when he finally looked up, his voice was quiet but clear. Then we go together. We arrived at Evelyn and Alan's house on a Sunday evening, just after sunset, the sky still faintly glowing behind the rows of oak trees lining their cul-de-sac like sentinels waiting for a war no one wanted to admit had already begun. And as the four of us walked up the driveway together, Clara and Owen slightly ahead, Vanessa and I carrying the bags with our equipment and documentation, I felt the same kind of slow, focused adrenaline that used to hum in my chest during high-risk photo shoots. The kind where one wrong move could ruin a week's worth of work or cost you your name. The front door opened before we even rang the bell. Evelyn standing there in a pressed blouse and earrings that glinted in the porch light. Her smile fixed but faltering at the edges when she saw the four of us instead of just Clara and Owen. And for the first time since I'd met her, she looked like someone unsure of which script to follow, which role to play, when the stage lights refused to dim. Alan stood a few feet behind her in the foyer, his posture relaxed but his eyes cold and calculating, the kind of look he usually reserved for tense boardroom dinners or unexpected audits. And as we stepped inside, no one spoke beyond a few obligatory greetings that landed like stones dropped into still water, each one disturbing the quiet without shattering it. Clara asked if we could use the living room, said we had something to share, and though Evelyn hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of a decorative console table, she nodded and stepped aside, gesturing stiffly toward the sitting room, as if she were still hosting some polite family affair and not bracing for the collapse of an empire she'd spent decades crafting. We arranged the seating deliberately, Clara and Owen beside each other on the couch, Vanessa and I across from them in the wing chairs, leaving Evelyn and Alan to sit opposite the television screen, where I had already queued the files on my laptop, each video paused and ready, each document collated in a binder that rested neatly on the coffee table, like a dossier waiting for review in a courtroom. For a few moments, no one said anything. Then Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and began speaking, not with anger or accusation, but with the kind of tired clarity that only comes after the scales have fallen completely from someone's eyes, and they can finally see what's been sitting in front of them all along. She told them about the drink, about the strange film on the surface, about the switch and the aftermath, about the lab results that confirmed something had been added, measured, deliberate, and medically traceable. She told them about the footage, security videos that showed Evelyn alone in the kitchen, adding something to one of the glasses, then denying it later with a smile that now read more like a weapon than a gesture of warmth. She told them about Mason. And when Evelyn opened her mouth to interrupt, Clara raised one hand, not abruptly, but with a calm authority that silenced the room more effectively than shouting ever could. "No more rewrites," she said, her voice firm. "No more spinning it into something else. I'm going to play these videos now, and then you can respond." Evelyn sat back, eyes wide, her lips pressed tightly together, and Alan shifted slightly in his seat, crossing one leg over the other like he was preparing to endure rather than listen, already calculating what could be denied, what could be explained away as unfortunate misunderstandings or exaggerated emotional reactions. But the videos didn't lie. The first showed Evelyn preparing the drinks, the vial, the stirring, the wipe of the rim, the exact motions I had witnessed from the edge of the kitchen that night, but now captured on film, indisputable, cold, clinical. The second showed Alan sipping from the tampered glass, the timing matching precisely with the onset of his symptoms, his face contorting in discomfort before pushing back from the table and stumbling toward the hall. The third showed their argument in the kitchen, her furious that he drank the wrong glass, him shouting that this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this. And for the first time since entering the house, Evelyn's hands began to shake slightly in her lap, her composure cracking like old lacquer over rotten wood. The fourth video was shorter, but its content landed harder. Alan calmly instructing Evelyn to start planting seeds. Evelyn replying that Clara would think the divorce was her own idea. The words chilling not because of how loud they were, but because of how normal they sounded coming from the mouths of two people who'd raised their children on politeness and protocol. When the screen finally went dark, No one moved for several long seconds. Then Owen turned to his father, his face tight and unreadable, and asked, "Did you ever love us? Or did you just want control?" Alan's mouth opened, then closed again, and Evelyn leaned forward, her voice high and sharp, clearly rehearsed despite the tremble at the edges. "You're twisting things," she said. "That footage is out of context. Miles has always been resentful of our closeness with you, too. He's manipulated everything to make us look like monsters." "He didn't record your voice," Clara said quietly. "You did." "And Mason," Owen added. "Vanessa, the patterns just write themselves, don't they?" Evelyn turned toward me then, her gaze narrowing like a scalpel finding soft tissue, and asked, "Is this what you wanted? To humiliate us? To destroy this family?" I reached into my bag, pulled out a copy of the binder, and slid it across the table to Alan. "This contains everything," I said, my voice level. "The footage, the lab reports, the prescriptions, the statements from Mason, Vanessa, and others. No one outside this room has seen it yet." Alan looked down at the binder, but didn't touch it. "I'm not going to the police," I continued, "because Clara asked me not to, for now. But if either of you so much as send one more message implying that I'm not enough, that our marriage is a mistake, or that this family is only safe when you're the ones holding the strings, then this information will go to your business partners, your golf club, your board affiliations, and every single person who's ever mistaken you for honorable." Evelyn scoffed, but it sounded more like a hiccup of fear than dismissal. Alan finally looked up, his face pale but composed, and said, "You came into this family without earning it, without building anything, and now you want to dismantle it." "No," Clara said, rising to her feet with a finality that stilled the room. "We're just pulling down the mask." Owen stood beside her. Vanessa did too. And for the first time in that house, in that curated sanctuary of old money and passive aggression, Evelyn and Alan were left seated and outnumbered, the quiet no longer working in their favor, the weight of silence now belonging to us. After we left the house that night, the four of us walked back to our cars without saying much, the thick silence stretching between us like a protective barrier that none of us wanted to puncture too soon. And as Clara slid into the passenger seat beside me, her fingers trembled slightly as she buckled her seatbelt, her eyes fixed forward but unfocused, like she was still seeing her mother's expression frozen at the edge of disbelief and indignation. We drove in near total silence, the low hum of the tires against the road barely enough to break the heaviness that had settled between us, and only once we turned off the main road, back into the quiet of our neighborhood where the houses sat still under the streetlights, did Clara finally speak, her voice raw and quiet as she said, "I think they really believed we'd never stand up to them." I kept my eyes on the road but reached over to touch her hand, holding it firmly, not squeezing, just enough to let her know I heard her and that I wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not when the war had finally reached its turning point. Back at the house, Vanessa sent one short text to Clara. Just 3 words. "You did good." And then everything was still again like the hours before a thunderstorm where the air thickens but nothing falls yet, and we both sat on the couch for a long time without speaking, staring at the dark TV screen like it might show us what came next. That week, Evelyn and Alan didn't call. They didn't text, didn't send emails, didn't post any cryptic messages on social media for Clara to decode. And for the first time in years, there was a strange calm, fragile but present, in the way we moved through the house, the way she smiled when she made coffee, the way I started sleeping through the night again without bracing myself for some new form of undermining wrapped incivility. But peace, especially peace earned by confrontation, never lasts long in families like Clara's. It was Owen who broke the silence first. He called late on a Wednesday night, his voice low and strained, asking if I could meet him privately, just the two of us at a bar near the edge of town, and though he insisted everything was fine, I could hear the tremor behind his words, the one that said something's not fine at all. I found him already seated in a booth near the back, nursing a drink that was mostly ice by the time I arrived, and when I slid into the seat across from him, he didn't look up right away, just swirled the glass slowly and said, "I don't know who they are anymore." He looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen him, like someone who had finally started replaying every moment from childhood through a new, unfiltered lens and realized most of what he'd believed had been carefully edited by two people who called it love, but practiced control. "They've started cornering James," he said, naming his son for the first time in the conversation, telling him stories about how I was wild when I was younger, how Vanessa kept me away from them, trying to make him think she's unstable. I sat back, the chill of that sentence crawling up my spine, because I could hear Evelyn's voice behind those words, soft and sweet and sharpened just enough to cut without bleeding, the way she had always disguised malice as maternal concern. "They're starting early," I said, and Owen nodded. "They don't stop," he replied. "They just shift targets." He reached into the small bag beside him and pulled out another folder, thinner than the one we presented during the confrontation, but just as damning, and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of text messages Evelyn had sent to James, emails forwarded from school accounts that hinted at concerns regarding home environment, and a printed copy of a social media comment Evelyn had posted under a fake name, questioning Vanessa's mental stability on a parenting forum that Vanessa had unknowingly contributed to earlier that month. "She's sabotaging again," I said, and he nodded. "She never stopped," Owen replied. "But now she's gotten smarter, more careful." We sat in silence for a long time, both of us staring at the folder like it might combust between us, and eventually I asked, "What do you want to do?" Owen didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he looked up and said, "We make it impossible for them to keep hiding." Over the next 10 days, we gathered everything. Not just the files from the dinner or the videos from Vanessa or the scholarship sabotage or the toxicology reports. We went back further, tracked down old acquaintances from Clara's childhood, former neighbors, ex-family friends who'd quietly drifted out of their lives without explanation, all of whom had stories that mirrored ours in different shapes. A boyfriend who was suddenly sent to military school. A close friend whose family moved away after rumors spread that she was influencing Clara in dangerous ways. Even a teacher who remembered Evelyn calling the school to demand Clara be pulled from class because the curriculum encouraged too much individualism. Each story was like a thread pulled from the same woven lie. By the end of the second week, I had a hard drive that felt heavier than any camera I'd ever carried, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represented, a record of decades of emotional sabotage, manipulation disguised as protection, and abuse masked as legacy. Clara watched me organize the files one evening and said quietly, "I used to think they were just complicated, strict. Now I think they're dangerous." "Truth is never quiet forever," I said, and she nodded. We printed select pages, highlighted, dated, labeled, and bound them with a note addressed to Evelyn and Alan. "This ends now," or we make it end. And then we waited. We didn't hear back for 3 days. And on the 4th, a delivery van pulled into our driveway, carrying a certified letter from a legal office downtown. No lawsuit, no threats, just a note from their attorney, confirming the transfer of ownership for the house we'd been renting from Alan's real estate group, now signed over to us in full, along with the establishment of a trust for any future children we might have. No apology, no letter, just assets and silence. Not contrition, not peace, but retreat. The envelope with the deed sat unopened on our dining table for nearly an hour, while Clara paced slowly from the hallway to the kitchen and back again, her arms folded tightly across her chest, and her jaw clenched the way it always was when her body moved faster than her thoughts. And I waited quietly, not offering interpretation or reassurance, because this wasn't about whether we'd won anything. It was about whether her parents had just admitted guilt in the only way they knew how, through calculated control disguised as generosity. When she finally sat down and pulled the documents from the envelope, her hands were steady, but her shoulders told a different story, rising and falling unevenly as she scanned the fine print, her eyes moving back and forth with surgical precision. And when she reached the bottom of the last page and saw the signature, Alan's, not Evelyn's, something in her expression shifted, not with relief, but with grim confirmation that even their surrender was structured, deliberate, and incomplete. "They're buying silence," she said, her voice low and flat, but not uncertain, and I nodded slowly, already knowing what she meant because I had seen that tactic play out too many times in the lives of people who mistake control for love and silence for loyalty. "But we're not selling it," I said, and she didn't respond, just set the papers aside and reached for the flash drive, still sitting on the edge of the table. The same one we had used that night in the living room. The one that still held every voice, every lie, every moment they thought wouldn't come back to haunt them. That night, as we lay in bed with the ceiling fans spinning above us and the sounds of a neighborhood winding down outside our open windows, Clara asked me a question I wasn't expecting, her voice barely audible in the dark. "What happens when the baby's born?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I hadn't realized how deeply that thought had been clawing at the back of my mind since the moment we received that letter. Since the moment we saw Evelyn holding James's hand in Owen's driveway with a smile too wide and a voice too sweet. "We don't let them near her," I said eventually, and Clara turned toward me slowly, resting her hand on my chest in the way she always did when she was trying to ground herself in something real. "I want her to know the truth," she whispered. "Not just about them, but about who we are, about why we chose to walk away instead of letting them pretend we agreed to their version of the story." "She'll know," I said, and this time I didn't hesitate, because we'll show her the difference between being loved and being managed. In the months that followed, Evelyn and Alan kept their distance, sending only the occasional card, blank inside, apart from a printed signature and a vague, seasonally appropriate sentiment. And each time one arrived, Clara would open it slowly, examine it like a piece of evidence, and place it in a box she kept in the studio closet, not out of nostalgia, but as a record of their new language, polite, restrained, and empty. Then, just after Elodie was born, a week early, healthy, and with a cry that pierced through every thought I had ever had about fear and love and purpose, we received a package, hand-delivered, wrapped in gold foil with a white ribbon so tight it left an imprint on the edges of the box, and Clara stared at it for a full minute before cutting the ribbon and lifting the lid. Inside was a small pink cardigan, clearly handmade, with a tag that read for our granddaughter from Nana Evelyn and Grandpa Alan, and beneath it, tucked carefully into a small envelope, was a printed invitation to their country club's holiday brunch, addressed only to Clara and Elodie. No mention of me. No space for us. Clara placed the cardigan gently on the counter, picked up the envelope, and tore it in half with calm, precise movements, not angrily, not emotionally, just decisively. And then she turned to me and said they still think they're in control. I took the sweater, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the box, then wrote a single note on plain cardstock. "Please respect the boundaries we've already made clear." We didn't hear from them again for weeks. And during that time, I opened my gallery downtown, a space I've been quietly building for over a year with the help of a few close clients and friends, one that didn't bear anyone else's name or stamp of approval. And on opening night, Clara stood beside me in a navy dress with Elodie on her hip, both of them beaming under the warm lighting while guests walked through the exhibits I had curated without compromise. The final wall held a series I called Inheritance, a black and white collection of portraits layered with textured landscape overlays. Quiet, sharp, deliberate, each image paired with a single word etched into the frame: voice, distance, lineage, choice. Near the end of the evening, Alan and Evelyn walked through the door. They didn't announce themselves, didn't bring gifts or flowers or empty praise, just strolled in wearing conservative evening wear and that subtle smile they reserved for moments they hoped could be rewritten with enough restraint and performance. Alan walked the gallery without speaking, his eyes flicking from photo to photo with the kind of silent calculation I had learned to interpret long ago, while Evelyn made small, soft comments to no one in particular, touching frames gently, but never too long, like she didn't want to leave fingerprints on something she knew she didn't help build. Eventually, they reached the final photo. Alan looked at it, an image of Clara holding Elodie in front of a mountain lake, both of them backlit by sunrise, eyes closed in the quiet of their own moment, and said with a voice so carefully measured it almost sounded respectful, "You're talented." I looked at him, camera still in hand, and replied, "That was never the question." Evelyn nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and without another word, they turned and left. Later, as I locked the front door, Clara slipped her hand into mine and asked, "Do you think they've changed?" I stood quietly for a moment, watching the reflection of our family in the glass door. Elodie asleep in her sling against Clara's chest, the two of us worn, but steady beneath the soft glow of our own making, and said no, but they finally understand they can't change us. The first winter with Elodie came faster than I expected, the late afternoons folding into early darkness before we could finish a single errand or even manage a full night's rest. And while most of our days were filled with diapers and late-night feedings and the strange, wonderful rituals of adjusting to life with a newborn, there was still a part of me that watched every car that passed slowly in front of the house and every unexpected letter in the mail with a level of guardedness I didn't yet know how to turn off. Clara said I was overcorrecting, that maybe we should let the quiet be quiet for once, but I could tell she was still watching too, still expecting the return of the version of her parents who operated like shadows, not with open conflict, but with invisible decisions designed to cut off oxygen from the people they claimed to love. It wasn't until early December that the next sign arrived, this time in the form of a holiday newsletter that Evelyn had apparently mailed to every extended family member, club acquaintance, and charitable board contact she had ever curated in her audience. And while most of it was filled with updates about Alan's investments and James's growing vocabulary, there was a section near the end that caught Clara's eye and made her face freeze as she read the last paragraph aloud. "We're thrilled to welcome the newest addition to our family, our beautiful granddaughter Elodie, whose name honors both sides of our family history and whose arrival has brought peace, joy, and a renewed sense of connection during a year of growth and reflection." Clara read it twice before she said anything, and then she handed it to me and whispered, "They've rewritten everything again." There was no mention of the confrontation, no reference to the silence, no acknowledgement of the very clear boundaries that had been established and then repeatedly ignored. Just a neat little bow placed over months of calculated sabotage and emotional warfare, all erased in a few carefully chosen words printed on glossy cardstock with a snowflake watermark and embossed gold borders. We didn't respond. But 2 days later, we received a voicemail from an old family friend congratulating Clara on the reunion, saying how proud she must be of Evelyn for taking that first brave step toward healing, and how Alan was so moved when he spoke about how much Elodie looks like Clara did at that age. Clara stood in the hallway holding the phone like it was a live wire. And when the message ended, she just said, "They've decided we're a part of their story again, whether we agree or not." I spent the next week assembling a file I hadn't touched in over a month, revisiting the recordings, sharpening the transcript notes, updating the timestamps, and preparing a curated set of materials that could, if needed, remind everyone what the truth looked like when stripped of presentation and pretense. But Clara stopped me. Not because she didn't want justice, and not because she didn't believe they deserved to be exposed, but because she had realized something I hadn't yet fully accepted, that continuing to fight people who refuse to admit they've been defeated only gave them permission to keep rewriting the narrative over and over again. "They want us to chase them," she said, "to stay in orbit around their version of the truth. And the more we try to correct them, the more they twist the next version to make us look obsessed or cruel or bitter. So what do we do?" I asked, genuinely unsure for the first time in weeks whether silence or action would yield more power. "We build something bigger than their story," she said, not with defiance, but with the clear-eyed calm of someone who had finally stopped asking for her parents' approval and started defining success on her own terms. That Christmas, we didn't visit. We stayed home in the house we now owned outright, wrapped gifts for Elodie that she was too young to understand, and took turns holding her during the long, quiet stretches between family video calls and sleepy feeds, and for the first time in years, we didn't have to wonder whether we were being watched, judged, or positioned. We were simply allowed to exist, to breathe in a space we had fought to make ours. Then, in early January, an envelope arrived postmarked from Alan's company. It wasn't a holiday card or a legal document. It was a glossy brochure for his firm's annual review, something they sent to investors and partners every year, full of earnings reports and glossy spreads featuring high-profile properties, growth forecasts, and meticulously chosen photographs designed to convey stability, prestige, and forward thinking. Except this time, the photos weren't generic. They were mine. Architectural shots I had taken years earlier now featured across multiple pages with photo credits buried in the lower margin. Photography by Miles Thatcher. And while there was no letter, no explanation, no note of acknowledgement, I knew exactly what it meant. He'd used my work. Publicly. Permanently. Clara held the brochure with both hands, flipping through it slowly, and when she reached the centerfold, an aerial landscape I'd captured in the high desert before I'd even met her, she let out a long breath and said, "I think this is the closest we'll ever get to an apology." "It's not an apology," I said. "It's an admission." And that was enough, because it meant he understood now. Understood that I wasn't going away, that I wasn't going to break, and that the story they had tried to write without me had ultimately failed because it was built on silence I no longer offered and on submission I never gave them in the first place. Later that week, I received an email from a small magazine that covered independent galleries of photographers, asking for an interview about my recent opening, and during the conversation, when they asked what had inspired the Inheritance series, I paused just long enough to remember Evelyn's voice saying, "She'll think the divorce was her idea," before replying with the most honest sentence I could offer. I wanted to explore how control can pass through a family like an heirloom, and how reclaiming your voice sometimes means letting go of the need to be understood by the people who trained you to stay quiet. The editor asked if that quote could close the feature. I said yes, and when the article came out 2 weeks later, I printed a copy and slid it into Elodie's memory box. Not because I wanted her to carry the burden of our past, but because I wanted her to know, someday, that we didn't just survive our inheritance. We rewrote it. The spring that followed felt quieter than any in recent memory. Not because the world had softened or slowed, but because for the first time in years, Clara and I no longer flinched at the sound of our phones vibrating across the kitchen counter or found ourselves bracing at the sight of an unexpected envelope sitting atop our mailbox. And that silence, earned rather than granted, settled over the house like something sacred, like a peace we had forged rather than found. We spent mornings walking Elodie through the neighborhood wrapped in her woven sling, her head tucked beneath Clara's chin while the breeze filtered through blooming dogwoods and the world smelled like cut grass and unspoken forgiveness. And we found ourselves talking less about what we had left behind and more about what we could build from here forward. A life that didn't ask permission to feel joyful. A family whose story didn't require editing for someone else's comfort. It was during one of those walks, when the sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the roofs and Elodie had fallen asleep with one hand curled into Clara's collar, that she turned to me and said, "Do you think they'll ever really let go?" Her question didn't come from fear or hope, but from the practical awareness of someone who knew that control didn't just vanish when you stopped feeding it. It changed shape, sought out new routes, found quieter cracks to slip through, and I thought carefully before answering, watching a sprinkler twitch in a neighbor's lawn like it might spark to life and disrupt the moment. "I think they already know they lost," I said finally, "but I don't think they'll ever stop trying to make it look like they didn't." And I meant it, not bitterly, not even angrily, but with the clarity that only comes when you stop waiting for closure from people who mistake proximity for connection and obedience for love. That evening, Clara received an invitation. It arrived in her inbox with a subject line that read "Celebrating Legacy," a foundation gala in honor of Alan and Evelyn, and the body of the email described an upcoming event hosted by one of their philanthropic organizations, inviting select family members to attend a private dinner, slideshow presentation, and reflection on the values passed through generations, with a note that said dress code, formal. Speech opportunities available upon request. Clara didn't open the attachment. She read the first few lines, let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in her lungs for a decade, and closed her laptop with the same calm precision she'd used when sealing the envelope to return their Christmas brunch invitation. Later that night, after we'd put Elodie to bed and the house had dimmed into its quiet rhythm of clicking radiators and wind against the windows, I found Clara sitting in my studio, flipping through the black and white print from the Inheritance series again, her fingers tracing the word distance embossed into the frame of the portrait where she stood alone on a cliffside, facing the sea with her back to the camera and her hair pulled into a braid Evelyn used to make for her every Sunday morning. They want a story that feels clean, she said without turning toward me. Something that makes them look generous and wise and misunderstood, but they don't want the actual truth of how we got here. I nodded, knowing she didn't need my agreement to continue, but offering it anyway. What if we told our version? She asked, finally looking at me, her eyes sharper now than they'd been in months. Not angry, not sad, but electric with intention. We already have, I said, gesturing to the photos around her, to the gallery catalog on the table, to the still unopened box of newsletters that had featured our exhibit without once mentioning Evelyn and Alan's names. No, Clara said, her voice firm now, not just in photos or interviews. We tell the full version, in our own words, on our terms. The idea had been hovering for a while, unspoken between us, but now it had weight. A book, maybe, a documentary, an exhibit with audio interviews. Not as an act of revenge, and not even as a warning, but as a record, for Elodie, for others, for anyone who needed to know that manipulation didn't need to come with bruises to leave scars, and that surviving, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of authorship. In the following weeks, we began to write. Clara dug through old journals, school assignments, letters she kept for reasons she couldn't explain until now, and I transcribed hours of footage. Some we'd used already, some we hadn't had the space or readiness to face until the rawness faded into something legible. We spent evenings discussing structure, whose voice would carry the introduction, what story threads would be told from first person and which from witness, and we agreed early on that there would be no names included that weren't already public, no vindictive language, no dramatizations. Just truth, told clearly. During one of those sessions, Clara said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. They tried to teach me that love meant keeping secrets that hurt me more than they protected anyone else. We included that line in the prologue. By summer, a draft was ready. We shared it with Vanessa first, who read the entire thing in one sitting and then called us with her voice shaking, saying, I didn't know how much I'd buried until I saw it written down. Owen read it next, quietly, then twice. And afterward, he sent us a short email with no subject line and only 5 words. I'm proud of both of you. James, now old enough to pick up on tension, but still young enough to trust instinct over politics, asked Owen why Grandma Evelyn didn't visit much anymore. And Owen, perhaps for the first time, answered honestly but gently, telling him, because sometimes even family forgets how to be kind, and we have to remind them by not letting them forget what happened. Clara and I made no announcements. We didn't send copies to her parents. We didn't even include their names in the acknowledgments. We simply let the truth live, uncontained and uncurated. And slowly, word began to spread. Not loudly, not virally, but through the kind of slow, deliberate conversation that passes between readers who recognize pieces of themselves in someone else's story. An email forwarded with a note that said, you need this. A dog-eared page shared between sisters who hadn't spoken honestly in years. A quiet conversation in a therapist's office that ended with a client saying, that's the first time I've felt seen. And one afternoon, as we walked through a bookstore that had agreed to stock a limited run of the memoir, we found our story tucked between 2 shelves labeled Family and Recovery. And Clara reached out, ran her hand gently along the spine, and whispered, we didn't just take back the narrative. I looked at her, Elodie sleeping soundly in the sling between us. We became the authors. The first time we received an actual message, not a mass-mailed newsletter or vague family-wide announcement, but a real, direct communication, was a month after the book's quiet release, and it came not from Evelyn or Alan, but from a former family acquaintance, someone who had been at our wedding, someone Clara hadn't spoken to in over 6 years, whose name she barely remembered until she opened the email and saw the subject line. You were right. The message was short, respectful, and shockingly candid. It acknowledged having read the memoir in a single sitting, confessed to once believing Evelyn's carefully curated explanations about Clara's emotional distance and my professional instability, and apologized for never questioning the version of events they had been fed so gently and consistently over the years. They were so convincing, the woman wrote. They made it seem like they were worried about you, like they were to try to keep you safe, but now I see it. How subtle it all was, how it never sounded cruel until you realized what it cost you. Clara read the email once, closed her laptop, and walked into the backyard where the roses she planted at the start of spring were beginning to bloom in quiet, perfect spirals. And when I followed her outside and asked what she was thinking, she said, "I used to think they'd win by making people doubt me. But I never realized how many people were also doubting themselves." That realization, gentle, enormous, seemed to settle into the spaces where old anger used to live. The book didn't become a bestseller. It didn't climb charts or spark viral debates, and it didn't land us on a talk show couch or earn us a book deal for the sequel we weren't planning to write. But it did something better. It started conversations. Emails came in slowly, then steadily, each one echoing the others. "Thank you for giving language to what my family never let me say. I didn't know anyone else went through this. I thought I was the only one who had parents like that." Some letters came from therapists who had recommended the memoir to clients as a lens through which to explore grief and gaslighting. Others came from adult children estranged from their parents, people who had spent years trying to explain what had gone wrong, but found themselves constantly misheard or dismissed, not because their pain wasn't real, but because it didn't come with the kind of bruises people expected when someone said abuse. One message came from someone who simply wrote, "You helped me forgive myself." That one stayed with Clara the longest. We framed it, just a text, no name, and placed it above her desk in the studio where she had begun sketching again, her pencil moving softly across large pages with no end goal other than to draw without being judged, to create without being corrected, to fill space without asking permission. Then, one morning in mid-June, a letter arrived. Handwritten, from Evelyn. No return address. No stationery with embossed initials. Just a small envelope, folded and sealed, addressed in careful script that I recognized immediately because I'd seen it on so many wedding invitations and thank you notes and birthday cards over the years, all of them worded like obligations dressed up as affection. Clara held the letter for a long time before opening it. When she did, she didn't read it aloud. She read it once, silently, standing at the kitchen counter while Elodie sat in her high chair, smearing applesauce across her bib. And when she finished, she folded it slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it face down beside the fruit bowl. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just said, "It's not really an apology." Later, she showed it to me. The letter was 2 pages long and filled with what I could only describe as emotional sleight of hand. Phrases like "I'm sorry you felt that way," and "I never meant for things to spiral." And we all make mistakes when we're trying to protect the people we love, each one carefully constructed to imply remorse without ever admitting responsibility. The final paragraph was the most revealing. It said, "I hope one day you'll understand why we made the choices we did, and that you'll see it wasn't about control, but about fear. Fear that we might lose you to someone who didn't understand the weight of who you were meant to become." Clara read that line a second time, then handed the letter back to me. "She still thinks she gets to define who I was meant to be," she said. And her voice wasn't angry. It was quiet, reflective, and infinitely more powerful than anything Evelyn had written. We didn't reply. Instead, we spent the rest of the day in the studio, moving things around, installing a new hanging system for a summer exhibit Clara was co-curating with a local arts collective, one themed around voices that had been historically silenced. Not just politically, but personally. Clara titled the exhibit "The Quiet Rebellion." One of the pieces was a black and white portrait she had taken of me holding Elodie on my chest, both of us asleep in a sunlit chair, the kind of image that looked peaceful until you read the caption etched in small lettering beneath the frame. This is what breaking a cycle looks like. The night of the opening, the gallery filled with more people than we'd expected. Friends, clients, students, strangers who had found us through the book or through word of mouth, all of them wandering between canvases and installations with the kind of reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. And sometime around 8 p.m., Clara stood on a small platform near the center of the room and gave a short speech. Not about her story specifically, not about her parents, and not about revenge, but about reclamation, about the act of choosing what parts of your story to carry and what parts to finally set down. "We don't need to be angry forever," she said, her voice clear, "but we do need to be honest. Because silence doesn't protect people, it erases them." The applause was soft but sustained. And later, after we'd locked up and turned off the lights, We stood outside on the sidewalk with Elodie asleep between us and the warm buzz of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, and I asked Clara what she thought would happen next. She didn't answer right away. She just looked up at the sky, then back at me, and said, "We keep telling the truth, even when no one's asking for it." Summer deepened with the kind of heat that made time feel slower, the days stretching long and bright and thick with the scent of sun-warmed cedar and honeysuckle as Elodie began to toddle through the backyard with unsteady feet and wide eyes, her tiny hands reaching for everything as if the world itself had only just been invented, and in those golden hours where nothing urgent pressed against the edges of our life, Clara and I found ourselves beginning to breathe in a way that felt different. Not cautious, not guarded, but something closer to trust. Not trust in her parents, and not even trust that the damage they had done would ever be fully repaired, but trust in the boundaries we had built, the version of our lives that didn't depend on anyone else's permission to be real, to be valid, to be enough. Elodie's first birthday was approaching, and while we didn't plan anything extravagant, just a gathering in the backyard with a few close friends and family who had stood beside us when things fell apart, we were deliberate in our guest list, in our invitations, and most of all in the decision not to include Evelyn and Alan. It wasn't meant as punishment. It wasn't revenge. It was simply a reflection of the truth we had already lived, of the clarity that had come not from vengeance, but from refusal. The refusal to keep offering opportunities for them to reshape the narrative or fold their distortions back into moments meant to be joyful, untouched by their revisions. But that didn't stop the attempt. 3 days before the party, we received a letter. This one was typed and signed and anonymous in a way that was both obvious and performative, full of familiar phrasing and strategic vagueness that made it clear Evelyn had written it, even if she'd chosen not to attach her name. It's unfortunate that certain stories have been told without all the facts. It began, and while no one is perfect, we had hoped that time and growth would allow space for healing instead of continued division. There was no mention of Elodie, no birthday wishes, no acknowledgement of the harm that had prompted the distance. Only a careful weaving of implication, a suggestion that the pain we'd named was melodrama, that our decision to protect our daughter was somehow petty or political. Clara read the letter once, and then tore it cleanly in half, not angrily, but with the calm, surgical grace of someone cutting a cord that had frayed beyond usefulness, and then she placed it in the kitchen trash and returned to icing cupcakes without a word, her hand steady, her smile untouched. That weekend, the backyard filled with people who didn't need to be convinced to love us. Vanessa arrived early with a tray of lemon bars and a look of quiet satisfaction that didn't need to be explained, while Owen carried James on his shoulders and handed me a wrapped box labeled Elodie's first toolbox, which turned out to contain a tiny wooden mallet, a plastic tape measure, and a note that read, "For whatever she wants to build and knock down." Elodie wore a paper crown Clara had made from gold cardstock, and when she reached for her first piece of cake with both hands and smeared frosting across her face, Clara leaned into me and said, "This is the version she'll remember." And I realized she wasn't just talking about Elodie. She was talking about herself. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the yard was littered with curling ribbons and paper plates, Clara sat on the steps with Elodie asleep against her chest and the last traces of sunlight painting her hair with copper and fire. And she said, "There's something I want to tell her someday, but I don't know when." "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice low so the words didn't press too loudly into the quiet. "That survival isn't the same thing as healing," she said, her voice steady but soft, "and that forgiveness doesn't have to mean re-entry." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us like a shared breath, and then I said, "She'll understand, because you'll show her." In the weeks that followed, we received one more letter, this time from Alan. It was shorter, colder, and far more direct than anything Evelyn had sent, a carefully composed document that read more like a final negotiation than a personal message. "We respect your desire for distance," it said, "and will not pursue further contact unless initiated. However, we reserve the right to protect our reputations should additional accusations be made in public forums or future publications." There was no warmth, no inquiry about Elodie, no regret. Just warning. Just veiled threat. Just Alan. Clara didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She simply scanned the letter, placed it beside the envelope from the foundation gala, and said, "That's their final move. Do you want to respond?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but offering it out of respect. "No," she said. "I already did." She walked into the studio and returned a few minutes later with a copy of the memoir, one of the limited-run hardcovers we'd set aside for family records, and slid it into a shipping box addressed to their attorney, taping it shut with one swift motion before writing, in clean, deliberate penmanship across the top. "This is the only version of the story that matters." She didn't include a note. She didn't need to. We never heard back. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly, the absence became less like silence and more like peace, less like a ghost and more like open air. And though the memories still surface sometimes, during holidays, during birthdays, during moments when something small reminded us of the years we spent contorting ourselves to fit a mold designed to erase us, we stopped trying to push them away. Instead, we let them settle, like sediment, like something old that no longer floated to the surface. And in that space, we grew. I finished a second gallery show that fall, one focused not on grief or confrontation, but on resilience, on reclamation, on what happens when people stop asking to be chosen and instead begin choosing themselves. Clara started teaching again, quietly, part-time, a small course at a community studio for women rebuilding creative lives after estrangement or trauma. And each week, she came home with a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen since the early years, back when everything felt possible and nothing had been narrowed by judgment disguised as concern. Elodie learned to say her first full sentence in October. 3 perfect words delivered in the back seat of our car as we pulled into the driveway. "I love home." Clara turned to me, tears in her eyes, but not falling, and said, "She doesn't even know what she just said." "She doesn't have to," I replied, "because she feels it." And that was enough. The last time I saw Evelyn and Alan was almost a year to the day after the confrontation in their living room. And though I hadn't planned on seeing them again, hadn't imagined a reason strong enough to breach the wall we'd constructed so deliberately and maintained with such intentional silence. It happened not with warning or drama, but on a quiet Sunday morning at the local farmer's market, where Clara had taken Elodie to pick out seasonal produce while I lagged behind by the coffee cart, waiting for 2 cups to be poured by a barista too young to know that sometimes what burns your tongue isn't the temperature, but the memory that floods your mouth when you take the first sip. They were standing near the flower stall, Evelyn holding a bouquet of white peonies she would no doubt photograph on her dining table before discarding them the next day, and Alan beside her, dressed in his usual half-casual slacks and sunglasses he wore even in the shade, both of them scanning the stands like tourists in a town they didn't really believe in. They didn't see me at first. Not until Clara and Elodie emerged from behind a chalkboard stand selling homemade honey, Elodie squealing with delight as she pointed at a booth with a basket of oranges, her tiny voice carrying further than she realized, and Evelyn turned, bouquet shifting slightly in her arms as her eyes landed on her granddaughter, wide with recognition that flickered so fast I almost missed the emotion behind it. She didn't wave. She didn't approach. But she looked, longer than she had to, and Alan turned too, following her gaze, his mouth setting into that practiced line of dignified detachment, the one he had used at board meetings and donor events, and now, apparently, while watching the child he had decided was better raised without his intervention. Clara noticed him next. Her spine didn't stiffen. Her grip on Elodie didn't tighten. She didn't flinch or retreat. She simply glanced over, met Evelyn's gaze across the market square, and nodded once, slowly, deliberately, without malice or invitation, like someone acknowledging a storm that had passed, leaving nothing behind but flattened grass and a changed horizon. And then she turned away. Elodie pulled at her sleeve, wanting to see the beeswax candles again, and Clara followed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she said something soft to our daughter, something I couldn't hear but could feel in the way Elodie giggled and leaned into her mother's shoulder with the ease of a child who had never been taught to fear the people who loved her. I watched as Evelyn lowered her eyes, turning back toward the booth without a word, adjusting the bouquet in her arms as though the flowers had become too heavy to hold, and Alan muttered something I couldn't hear as he placed a hand on her elbow and steered her away. Both of them walking quickly now, their posture betraying more than they meant to show. They didn't speak to us. It didn't follow. They just vanished into the crowd, moving through it like ghosts who had accidentally wandered into a world that no longer needed them to haunt it. I didn't mention it right away. I carried the coffee back to Clara, handed her the cup she liked, and when she looked at me with raised eyebrows, I nodded once to the space where Evelyn and Alan had just stood, and Clara exhaled, not with surprise or tension, but with a quiet finality that sounded like the closing of a book you no longer needed to finish reading. "They looked older," she said later, as we unpacked the groceries at home, placing tomatoes and herbs into glass bowls beside Elodie's tiny garden kit on the windowsill. "They looked smaller," I replied, and Clara didn't disagree. That night, we sat on the porch long after Elodie had fallen asleep, watching the sky turn from deep violet to black as the first stars emerged over the treetops. And for a long time, neither of us spoke, content to let the quiet fill the space where reflection used to demand answers. Eventually, Clara said, "Do you think they regret it?" I thought about Evelyn's eyes, about Alan's hand on her elbow, about the silence that followed our departure from their world. Not just the lack of contact, but the absence of interference, the stillness where control used to pulse like an engine running under the floorboards. "I think they regret losing the narrative," I said, "but I don't think they ever expected to lose us." Clara nodded, pulling her knees to her chest, her chin resting lightly atop them as she looked out at the darkened garden. "I used to think if they just apologized, really apologized, I'd be able to forgive them and start over," she said, "but now I think what I really wanted was for them to admit they saw me, that they knew exactly what they were doing, that the pain wasn't an accident. And since they won't," I asked, "I stopped needing them to," she said, her voice quiet but strong, "because I finally see myself." She reached for my hand then, fingers lacing with mine, and we sat that way as the wind shifted through the trees and the air filled with the quiet sounds of a life we had chosen, deliberately, painfully, but freely.